I think another source of certainly the white rock critic response to disco, and then what became more sort of prevalent, was that sense that it was escapist, and that it was about just having a party, if you like, and then no sort of relevance or meaning beyond that. The shared ecstasy thing seems a sort of solipsistic and selfish, if you like.
Well, you know, I think on one level there's nothing wrong with that. The escapism is kind of wonderful. It is, you know, ultimately what you want. But one of the things that excited me about club music was how, at least in the period that I was writing about, was that there was real messages. You know, there was a message in most of those records, or a lot of the records. And they were about coming together, they were about opening up, they were these kind of liberation songs in some ways. And I think that a lot of the records that really lasted for me are those kinds of things that really, that it meant something to hear that music on the dance floor, and it meant something about coming together and drawing people together and love of music and this kind of larger ideas. So it wasn't just about losing yourself, but it was about, you know, having somehow the sense of community that was very strong.
A sort of theory about it being like a kind of dance, as a kind of dance of liberation, perhaps from the 60s into the 70s, when people were feeling a little bit more liberated and they had spaces that they could go to, be together, and it wasn't about watching a band or an ego performing, it was just about listening and dancing and releasing. And I suppose that's one of the, you know, it's like a liberating thing to do, to dance, to lose yourself in music without sort of paying attention to what else is going on, but just listening and allowing your body and just communicating with people in that way, feeling free and feeling, you know, sexy, I guess. A lot of it is to do with sex, I'm sure. Just
absolutely, and in that sense, the idea of disco very early on being the black, the gay, the sexual, the orgasmic, a kind of otherness, if you like. Did it also become viewed as genuinely something dangerous? Hence the unbelievably extreme response to try and take the sting out of it, if you like.
Ideally, it would be nice to think that it was dangerous. In some ways, yeah, it probably, you know, for people who were threatened by that, maybe it was. But certainly, you know, for people involved in it, it was certainly didn't feel that way. It's nice to think that it could be a dark thing for some people outside of it, but I think when you were inside that, it was very opening up, you know.
Well, was there any sense when you were writing about it at the time that you might be sat here 30 years later talking about it?
No.
Did it feel very much like it was happening there, but it was fleeting?
Well, I really didn't think about the future of it. I was very much involved when I was writing a weekly column, as you are, that I was involved in that moment of a record coming out and discovering it and wanting to sort of evaluate it and see where it might go. I never thought about where it was going to go in the long run, because that wasn't particularly important at that moment.
And there must have seemed times during the last 20 years or so when it just seems to have completely disappeared.
Yeah. Well, and I'm delighted to think that it keeps coming back, that there's always it never seems to have gone away in a real way. And certainly right after disco was supposed to be over, there was Madonna, there was Grace Jones, there was, you know, New Wave, there was all kinds of material that was disco without a name. So I never felt that it was over.
You mentioned before that you feel now it's very much okay now to a certain extent, the word disco. I know what you mean, it's still inside us to an extent, but I do get the feeling it's getting a little better to be able to use the word.
I think definitely. I think it didn't ever go away really for a lot of people, and if you think about all the sort of soul artists and the Philly kind of side of the disco canon, if you like, that was kind of, you know, 4 to the floor, strings, horns, all the kind of Latin percussion, all the sort of basics of what you kind of think about as disco now, rather than the kind of avant-garde side of it. All that music is just classic black music, isn't it? It's still, you know, you're not gonna, that never got kind of tainted by, oh, that's disco, we're not, you know, things like Chic and Sister Sledge and the OJs and all the Philly stuff, it's still disco, but it's still, people still love it, don't they? I mean, some of it might be wedding music now, but it still does the job. It still makes people dance, and I don't think it has got such a stigma attached to it anymore.
Do you think also at the moment when, you know, kind of all music happens at once to an extent now, and also there's the sense of music so easily available, if you like, that the club and the private space and the slightly more sort of atmospheric place where you can gather to listen to music is more alluring in a way than it's ever been, because there is a sense of music being turned into something else elsewhere, you know, the way that you can get hold of music. That the idea of the disco now is far more a fascinating idea than it has been for a few years.
Well, I think what's made clubs more fascinating recently is the kind of death of the superstar, you know, all of the kind of preposterous elements of dance music that kind of imploded at the start of this decade. And so most of the interesting clubs now are like 100 to 300 capacity. So, and when you're playing to an audience of that small, you can play more interesting, more avant-garde and weird music and get away with it, and people will go with you. When you're playing to crowds of 1,500, they want a good night and they want to hear what Pete Tong played on a Friday. If you're playing to smaller crowds, I think you can get a bit weirder and play more interesting things. And there have been an explosion of those sorts of clubs in London, certainly, over the last 5 years. Haven't there? I mean, there's so many.
I think the internet has played a massive part in kind of people's knowledge and the interest that there is in dance music from that era all the way through, like, you know, say from 74 to 84 or something. Yeah. People can listen to, you know, an old mixtape of somebody and then go on a forum, find out every single track on there, then go on Discogs, buy every track on there. So there's a lot more collectors, there's a lot more interest, there's a lot more...
Does that make it harder for you? I mean, as a rock writer...
No, I like it because I like the fact that people are going to know stuff, right. Or they've already been listening to it in their living room before they've come out maybe, and then they're like, oh great, I can dance to it now in the context of a club. So I just love spreading. I can't stand it when people kind of cover things up and don't tell you what it is, or, you know, I just think share it and put it out there and kind of let these records that maybe there was maybe only 1,000 pressed at the time and it wasn't a hit and it got ignored, let them have a new life and let them put them on a compilation, or, you know, start playing them again. I think it's great. Yeah,
I mean, the big explosion in the last 5 to 6 years, I think, since the arrival of the internet as a serious force is European releases. Because the American side of it and the British side, we were well versed in. We knew all the labels, even the small labels, but what we didn't know was like the amount of kind of crazy records coming out of, you know, Finland and Greece and Italy and even foreign language records and Demis Roussos records, bizarrely.
This is another thing that's interesting about disco, ultimately, telling its history, is that it is unbelievably vast as well. And the other thing is where actually from the outside do you begin? I guess you begin by dancing, which has always been a problem for me. But on the other hand, just the big sense of, my God, you know, it is itself, as I can tell, you know, as much a place for aficionados and collectors and nerds than any other kind of music.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bottomless pit. I mean, there's even a Euro disco group from Russia called Zodiac that have very collectible records now on eBay, and you're just like, mad. Who'd have thought there'd have been disco groups in Russia?
Yeah, I think every European country had their version of.
Well, that's one of the things that really did help punish it a bit, though, wasn't it? The European
but then a lot of them have, like, you play the B side and it'll be some weird instrumental or some weird dub or some other weird track that they just sort of made in the studio. So it's kind of like there's the cheesy side, but even within the cheesiness, there's always something good to find in there that maybe got overlooked or wasn't. You know, there's always something on a Boney M album that can be played now that wasn't Ma Baker, do you know what I mean? There's always like that Banana Nos or whatever. Bananos and things like that. And it's incredible because even the cheesiest kind of artists or producers were still doing quite weird things, you know.
So what have you all got a guiltiest secret favourite disco record?
Well, actually, I've got a really guilty one that I've sort of discovered recently, but on the B side of Stars on 45, it's like an instrumental version without any of the kind of vocals, and it's actually really good. I was listening to it the other day, I was like, I'm playing that, definitely.
You got one, Bill?
Well, I guess things like I Dig You by Demis Roussos. I just have a perverse fascination with trying to find the worst conceivable artist and seeing if they've ever made a disco record that was good
Well,
or a danceable
I
record.
remember writing about Demis Roussos records when I was doing my column, because he had
In fact, I think you actually might have even got I Dig You from one of your columns.
probably because I never heard of this guy before, and suddenly there was this record that sounded like it actually could work. So I partly my feeling was DJs were listening to everything. I had to listen to everything, and so I tried to pull out the things that sounded reasonable and legitimate to me, and the things that I conceivably could make it. And certainly a lot of the stuff I wrote about did not happen. Yes. I mean, there are a lot of things that I got excited about for that week that I realized by the next week that was not going to work. Yeah. But
I still trust your taste.
Thank you. But I did really go with my enthusiasms as I was writing that column, and it was really, I was writing it with the DJs in mind, that I wasn't, I was writing for a trade paper, but I wasn't thinking about the rack jobbers. I was really thinking about the guys who were playing records.
This might be a really awful rock writer's question, and I apologise in advance for asking it. It may in itself actually open up why disco or dance music in a way is a different kind of thing that needs to be written in a different kind of way. But has there ever been, or is there an example of an album by a more traditionally disco-minded act, if you like, that you could?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Most of the Eurodisco acts, like Alec Constantinos, Cerrone, Giorgio Moroder, they made full-on albums, and a lot of them were kind of concept albums in the cheesiest way, but some of them were pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, Alec Constantinos.
Sumeria that he did.
Yeah.
Was kind of
Sumeria, Romeo and Juliet. I mean, they did.
Quite out there, really.
They were really kind of elaborately conceived projects.
Disco operas.
Yeah, they're like, it's the disco version of Yes.
And yeah,
basically.
I was going to say it's where it
Prog
moved with
disco.
prog, wasn't
Prog
it?
disco.
Yeah, prog disco. Now there's a genre. It's like the whole of disco in a way is a kind of
It's
concept.
a concept.
You know what I mean? And that when you put together a really good night, you're creating a particular concept.
Yeah.
But I think your disco credentials are quite high, Paul, anyway, because of Frankie and,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But I never danced to those records.
I know, but you were sort of part of it.
I stood very still.
Welcome to the Pleasure Dome is a really big record at Horsemeat Disco, so,
Yes,
that's still doing its job.
That used to be the opening track at the Warehouse as well, didn't it, in Chicago? I think they used to play that every night when they opened the club.
I do remember when I first played Relax to an NME journalist, very excited to just take, listen to this new label I've formed, I've got this great record. And I do remember him hearing it and playing it, and he walked off, and I heard him tell someone, "Oh, it's just an old disco record."
Well, yeah.
I always remember that. And I thought, disco? I never thought of it as a disco record.
Which is one of the reasons why all the disco people flocked to it right away.
You can tell how much we didn't know what we were doing, because when we did the 12-inch, we did it at 33 and a third RPM. We didn't put it at 45 because we didn't know what to do, so we put it at the wrong speed.